to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I am Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the university's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is the professional school of public affairs at the University of Minnesota. I am very pleased to welcome you to the third annual Nakasaka Dialogues. This is a lecture series that we've started that tries to stimulate conversations about the state of public life in America and encourages progress towards shared bonds. This series was established through the support of Kiyoshi Nakasaka. And Mr. Nakasaka is an alumnus of the Humphrey School and a great friend. Please welcome Mr. Nakasaka.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. As Professor Jacobs said, that this is the third series. And then this one is very special, that longtime friends, Jake Sullivan, will be here with us today. And then before, asking Jake coming out here, that I just wanted to share with you a short story that how great he is. He's, best and brightest of Minnesota, as well as the, this country too. But, Jake, as you know, that he used to be National Security Advisor who travel with a lot of security details and stuff. So last night I had a dinner with him. I gave him a ride, and then from St. Paul back to Minneapolis, and no security detail, of course not. And then I lost the way, and I got a little bit of panic, just, oh my gosh, and then Jake said, come down, that I give you direction. He just pulled out the phone and then direct me all the way to the back to the way where it was. So, that's how he advised all the presidents and, those important people. So, this is such a privilege, having him here with us today. And let's hear from him how he has been doing all those great stuff and then the future and stuff. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Nagasaka. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We encourage questions. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're here with us today, there'll be cards being passed around. Give us questions, give us challenging questions. We are eager for them. Those of you who are joining us online, and there are hundreds of people doing so, you'll see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. That's your opportunity to send us questions, so please do. Also, I want to let you know, if you're joining us online, that there is a closed caption feature at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to use that. It is a great honor to welcome Jake Sullivan. As some of you know, Mr. Sullivan is a Minnesotan, graduate from Southwest High School, and spent some time this morning with current Southwest students, and we welcome all of you today as well. Mr. Sullivan, as you know from the bios that have been passed out, was a national security advisor to President Joe Biden. He is currently the Kissinger Professor of Practice and Statecraft and World Order at Harvard University, where he is working on a book. And he is a senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. I am not going to go into read the entire bio because we want to spend time having a conversation and addressing your questions. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jake Sullivan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's really good to be back.
You know, thinking back over your time in the White House, it was quite eventful. There were a couple points there that really stood out. There was one point where we had the simultaneous convergence of a series of international crises that seemed to put us on the precipice of maybe a world war. We had Russia invading Ukraine with the potential that there could be a nuclear exchange and war with European allies and NATO. We also had, of course, Hamas's invasion of Israel and the potential of a three-front war with Lebanon and Syria, perhaps, and of course, Iran. And then we've had China's kind of lurking, threatening posture with regards to Taiwan, as well as the entire South China Sea. How did you view it within the White House? Did it seem like we were in a precipice of something really quite extraordinary?
Well, I think every national security advisor, after they leave, will say that their time in the seat was the most difficult, most challenging, most pressurized, most consequential time. But in my case, it's actually true. So, you know, now there were a lot of headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, even sometimes in the Star Tribune, saying on brink of war, U.S. on brink of war, getting dragged into another extended war in the Middle East, potentially getting dragged into direct conflict with Russia, potentially direct conflict with China over Taiwan, and lurking in the background always and occasionally popping up his head was Kim Jong-un and North Korea and the potential for conflict between North Korea and South Korea. And so one of the things that President Biden, myself, the entire national security team had to think about was, how do we stand up and support our friends and try to drive for a better and safer world while also keeping the United States from ending up sliding into war? And there were a lot of slippery slopes that we looked down upon during our time in office over the last 4 years. And I am very proud of the fact, actually, that when we passed the baton to the new administration, really for the first time in this century, the United States was not at war. Now, we continue to have soldiers in harm's way around the world. We continue to take incoming from proxy groups and others. So it's not like purely safe out there. But this, I think, was important to close this chapter of forever wars and to find a way for the United States to defend itself and support its friends while at the same time not sending another generation of young men and women off to fight and die.
There was a bipartisan report of the Commission on National Defense Strategy, and among its kind of conclusions is that the U.S. faced the most serious and challenging threats since 1945. So this is building on this theme, that the risk of near-term major war was quite real, and that World War III was a real possibility. These are extraordinary conclusions from a very high-level set of Democrat and Republican advisors. And part of the concern was that the U.S. lacked the military capacity to respond to this quite threatening environment. What were you able to do to make America's security more robust? And what do you see as the ongoing challenges in terms of national security for the country?
So I think there are three things in particular that really go to the core foundations of American strength and power in the world. The first is our economic and technological foundation and our ability to continue to lead the world economically and technologically. And one of the things that I worry about today is you look at our advantages in terms of the ability to attract talent from all over the world being badly eroded. Our unique ecosystem of research universities, government funding for basic science, and the private sector being disrupted in a really severe way. That real core foundation, if that goes, if our ability to power the next generation of innovation, deliver meaningful economic growth for our citizens, If we lose that, nothing else is really going to matter. So at an important layer, what we tried to do with President Biden's industrial strategy was through the Chips and Science Act, through the infrastructure law, through the Inflation Reduction Act, was make long-term, far-sighted strategic investments in the industries of the future. And to make sure that the United States was leading and not following when it comes to the technologies of the future, like artificial intelligence. Then the second layer is the defense industrial base. And when I arrived as National Security Advisor, I wasn't thinking too much about how many Patriot missiles we produced a year or how many 155 millimeter artillery shells we produced a year. Within a few months of Russia invading Ukraine, I was thinking about that every single day. And I would ask the Pentagon or the defense primes, how can we double, then triple, then quadruple the amount of shells because Ukraine needs them badly? And they would say, well, that's going to take a few years. So President Biden ultimately called in the senior leadership, acquisition leadership at the Pentagon to the Oval Office and said, not good enough, we got to go faster. And then you start looking under the hood and all the problems of workforce and supply chain and production timelines that have atrophied over the course of decades, that had caught up with us in a big way. And so we tried to arrest the slide in our defense industrial base and turn the corner. And one of the last speeches I gave as National Security Advisor was to say, we've made progress, but not good enough. We got to do more. And when I did the baton pass to the incoming team, one of the main things I impressed upon them was we've got to make these investments in a big way. Not to go fight wars, but frankly, to be in a position to deter war so that we're strong enough that we don't end up getting dragged into something. And then the third layer is what is America's greatest force multiplier that no other country in the world has, that we can call upon in a time of crisis? Allies. Good, strong, capable, democratic allies in Europe and Asia. And we worked hard to bring those alliances to new heights, expanding NATO, taking steps with our Asia-Pacific alliances that had never been seen before. And I feel when we passed the baton, our alliances were stronger than ever. And now we see an administration come in, go straight to Europe and tell Europe, you're the problem, and declare a trade war on every country in the world, including every one of our allies. I guess the one country we didn't declare a trade war on was Russia, who we did not impose tariffs on, but everybody else. So this concerns me. At each of these layers, the things that give America the strategic advantage to play a principled leadership role in the world are under strain. And it's important to focus on those foundational elements, even as we dealt with all the incoming and all the crises we were facing.
We've got lots of questions here, some of them shared by folks online. I want to dig in. We'll kind of pursue some of the issues you've already raised. There's a lot of concern in the country and here on campus about the administration's policy towards Israel and Gaza. And I think it's important to say that when Hamas invaded Israel, it committed heinous crimes. And it was the slaughter of innocent Israelis, some of whom were at a concert, and then folks who were, going about their everyday life. And this is a barbarity that bears emphasizing. Then the policy, as it's been pursued by the Biden administration and then Israel, of course, in its conduct of the war, led to genuine outrage in the United States and the world. And one of the questions that we've gotten online notes that Matthew Miller, who is a former State Department spokesman, said in a recent interview that without a doubt, Israel's committed war crimes. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert also confirmed that war crimes had been committed by Israel. Do you agree with that?
Well, let me answer this on two levels, and I'll answer it directly. War crimes is a legal determination made by lawyers who look at the specific cases of the application of force in ways inconsistent with international humanitarian law. We, in 2024, asked our lawyers and our policy people to take a hard look at this, and they produced a report. And the report said that it's reasonable to assess that Israel acted in violation of international humanitarian law, but it didn't reach a formal conclusion. So And that was something given to the State Department, the Defense Department to work through. They didn't reach a formal conclusion. So that's the legal determination. But then there's the moral determination. And is what Israel has been doing with respect to denying all food and medicine into Gaza for weeks on end a morally bankrupt policy? Yes, that is not acceptable. And when we were in office, one of the things I did as National Security Advisor daily was work to try to get more life-sustaining supplies to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And we never got enough. But I do believe that because of our pressure, we got crossings opens, we got trucks in, and we staved off the famine that people warned about. And the difference between that and what we're seeing now, which is basically an administration that has allowed Israel for several weeks, months, to have a total blockade on Israel, that is a huge difference. So I understand the depth of people's feeling on this issue, because I feel deeply on this issue, because it is a god-awful tragedy. It was a tragedy on October 7th when we saw the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And it has been a tragedy every day since. And you can't look at the images of Palestinian kids being killed, innocent people, too many innocent people losing their lives and not having access to what they deserve in terms of just the basic necessities of life, and not feel deeply about it. And I wrestle with policy choices. Is there something we could have done differently? Many people raise this question of cutting off arms. The challenge that we confronted, and this is not an argument or a defense, it's just bringing people into what it was like sitting in the seat, was Israel wasn't just fighting Hamas. Israel was being attacked by Hezbollah, by the Houthis, by the Shia militias in Syria, by the Shia militias in Iraq, and by Iran itself. And so cutting Israel off meant cutting them off in the face of a multi-front attack, not just in Gaza. But, you know, I will not stop in the days, months, years ahead engaging with people who come in good faith and say, you should have done this, or you should have thought of that, or why didn't you do this? Because this is an extremely painful issue. It's just a tragic human issue, and it weighs upon everybody who really had anything to do with it, from the president on down.
What could you have done? I mean, there was a sense that the Biden administration was so deferential to Israel that it ended up standing by as, you know, over 50,000 Palestinians and innocents were killed. What, in hindsight, what should have been done?
Well, I mean, this is where this question of cutting off arms comes in, and I've addressed that. And I've asked the question to others who say you should have done more. What exactly is it? Is it more public pressure? Is it, you know, was there a way of having a totally different outcome? And I will keep asking that question. The one thing I will say is I do think that this critique glosses over the sheer force of effort to go from the Israeli government position on October 8th, which was no food, water, or medicine in Gaza, period, at all, and what we were able to generate, which is a far cry in terms of our administration's ability to actually move Israeli policy than what you've seen today. But in terms of getting the conflict stopped, I mean, my view is that we have reached a point where both sides come to the table for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. They freeze the hostages and ends the war. That was the blueprint that President Biden put forward that was ultimately agreed right at the end of President Biden's term as Trump was coming into office. That broke down a few weeks in. We have to get back to the formula and end this war.
We've got in Minnesota a number of folks who are refugees from Ukraine. And of course,
oh, Larry, I'd just say one more thing on the Gaza front that I think is important to say. In the past few months, this administration has rounded people up off the street and out of dorm rooms because of their position because they've spoken out on this issue. And I know I've taken my fair share of criticism from people who think we should have done different things. And I disagree with some of that criticism, and other stuff I take on board because it's the legitimate questions. But one thing I believe passionately to my core is that people have a right to speak out on this issue. And I think
You get to finish your
important
comments.
for me to say that I categorically reject much of what was just said. I just reject it. And I will not sit here and allow people to say things which are fundamentally untrue. Much of what you just heard was untrue. But to the point I was just making, I strongly support the right of people to stand up and speak out and say what they feel about this, because that's what America's all about. And we can have differences on these issues, and we can disagree, and we shouldn't be rounding people up and deporting them because they write op-eds in student newspapers or even disrupt an event. And I would love the opportunity to have a real conversation, as I have with many people of good faith who have views on this. I think, disruptions of public events and assertions that I think are just wildly untrue, I don't buy into that. But man, I think this administration, the current administration, is going down a dangerous, un-American road by telling people that if you speak out on this issue, we are going to punish you. I would never do that. And I'm proud to be an American because we have this kind of free and open space.
As you know, over 100,000 soldiers and civilians have died in Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion. There are a number of Ukrainians who live in Minnesota now and are in a precarious position because their status is being challenged. Looking back, there has been questions and about could the administration have moved more quickly in bringing forward military capabilities and defense capabilities? Could it have given the Ukrainian military greater freedom to use those weapons to deter Russia and its aggression? What's your thoughts about that? Could this situation have been handled more aggressively to stymie the Russian slaughter?
I mean, it is interesting if you think about how this conversation's unfolded. The first question was about whether we might have ended up in World War III with Russia, and then this question is, should we have been more aggressive? And it's interesting. I'm honestly, that wasn't meant to be. I'm saying this because I think this is actually bringing people inside what we were being challenged with. What was President Trump's critique of President Biden on Ukraine? You're doing too much. You're going to take us to war. We're going to end up in World War III. We're going to have the first nuclear use since Hiroshima. What was the critique from those on the other side? You're not doing enough. You should be flowing more weapons. More U.S. systems should be used directly into Russia. This is what a president has to contend with on a very difficult policy like this. And when you have the head of your intelligence agencies come into you and say, Mr. President, if there's a collapse of Russian lines, there's a coin flip of a chance that Russia will use nuclear weapons to respond to that. You can't just say, well, forget that. We're going to completely ignore that. You have to factor that in. But you can't be paralyzed by it. You can't say, well, therefore, we're just going to walk away from Ukraine. And so I'm actually very proud of the fact that throughout all of this, including in the fall of 22, when this heightened risk of Russian nuclear use was really, front and center, we kept surging support, massive amounts of support. And the speed, scope, and scale of the support we provided to Ukraine, I think, is an enormous source of pride for the American people, leading the world in an arsenal of democracy to help Ukraine get to where it is in pushing back against Russian aggression. And I would add, there was a lot of things that we did quietly that I think people don't fully understand the scope of when they say, too little, too late. One of them was to invest very vigorously and very ambitiously in Ukraine's drone program, its ability to build this entire drone apparatus, which resulted in this kind of spectacular attack we saw in just the past few days. But it also has been a massive difference maker on the battlefield in keeping the Russians from being able to break through. So I can look back at the 3 years and say, I wish we could have done more and faster. And certainly in any circumstance like this, I'm open to that argument. But I think there's a bit of a caricature which suggests that the Biden administration wasn't really leaning in to help Ukraine stand up in the face of this brutal act of aggression. And I think that's just not right. I think, when this war started, people gave Kyiv a week. Ukraine was going to be wiped off the map. It is 2025 and Kyiv stands. And Ukraine stands as a free and independent country, first and foremost, because of what the Ukrainians have done, but also because the United States of America built a coalition of 50 countries that helped keep Ukraine free and independent. And I am damn proud of that.
And just by way of support for what you've just said, you've been very generous in meeting with Humphrey School students and University of Minnesota students many times over the years. And early in the Biden administration, after the invasion of Ukraine, you were meeting with us and you reported the daily briefings that you were going through, I think in the Situation Room, looking at the telltale signs that Russia was actually moving its protocols for the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, this wasn't just an abstract idea. It was a very kind of empirical, highly specific sort of enterprise to see what are the steps that might be taken to activate Russia's nuclear capability.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it doesn't get more real than sitting in the Situation Room, getting the incoming from the best experts the United States has to offer on Russia's military, on Russia's leadership intentions, and saying, like, we are at a heightened level of risk for something that really could spin out of control, and we need to manage our way through this. And being able to sit down with the president, the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of State, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the director of National Intelligence, and many others, and try to find a way to be strong, resolute, robust, and principled, but also find a way to make sure that the situation didn't spin out of control. That was a period of crisis management that required daily and sometimes hourly tending. It also required direct communication with the Russians, which is also not very well understood. That throughout this period, we were talking at high levels directly to the Russians to warn them about the consequences of nuclear use, to send clear messages about what we understood their intentions were. And having those channels, as we have had at multiple points in very difficult phases of the Cold War, was also incredibly important as a piece of trying to manage this situation and, again, not have it just spill out into something that could have dragged the United States into a conflict.
This is kind of a tour of some of the challenges that the Bush administration faced and that you had to wrestle with. Of course, Joe Biden during the Obama administration had been quite concerned about the U.S. getting locked into a war in Afghanistan. The war was dragging on well past 9/11. And then Joe Biden becomes president. And the decision is made early on in the administration that it's time to end this war in terms of the U.S. involvement. And yet at least the visuals of this, reminded some of us of, the horrific scenes of Saigon falling in 1975. You may remember those of you old enough will remember the photographs of people hopping onto the helicopters, grabbing onto the skids to try to get out of Saigon as it's about to be taken over. And it was seen as a sign in terms of our rushed and chaotic and deadly departure from Afghanistan, of weakness and incompetence. Some have suggested this might have sent a signal to Putin that he could invade Ukraine without real consequences. Relive that for us, and what were the mistakes that you would kind of say, well, that's something I wish we'd done differently?
Well, I want to start by saying that, I believe that Putin set in motion his fateful decision to invade Ukraine long before August of 2021. And the buildup was taking place, the emotional and almost theological case for it that he laid out in a long article in July was there as kind of the pretext that Ukraine fundamentally is part of Russia, that the Russian Empire has to be reconstituted. President Biden came into office and he looked at a situation where he had two choices. One choice was to add U.S. troops because we were down to 2,500, the fewest number since 2001. And the Taliban was at its strongest military point since 2001. That's what Joe Biden inherited the day he walked into office. So two choices. One, send more soldiers to Afghanistan for a war to restart on May 1st, which was the deadline President Trump and the Taliban agreed to, or end the war. And after two presidents had said, we're going to end the war, and then didn't, Joe Biden said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to end this war. Now, as we drew down over the course of the summer, and August came, in the span of a matter of days, the first provincial capital fell, and then Kabul fell. It happened lightning fast, faster than anyone had really anticipated. And when I look back on that period, one lesson that we learned was we were resistant to pulling out faster because the Afghan government was imploring us not to do so because they didn't want to precipitate the very collapse that ended up happening. Now, in the end, that collapse did happen. And so moving faster, moving earlier would have been advisable. That we can see now in hindsight, and we learned that lesson in future conflicts over the course of the Biden administration. But when you end a 20-year war with all of the pathologies and all of the mistakes over all of the years, it's not going to be straightforward. There's no simple way to do that. And that's why neither President Obama nor President Trump, both of whom wanted to end the war, ended it, because it's hard. It was hard. It was going to be challenging. And it was challenging. And it was even tragic. We lost 13 brave Americans at Abbey Gate, and a lot of Afghans lost their lives in that suicide bombing. But I believe that the United States of America is better off today in 2025 because we are not at war in Afghanistan, and we can be focused on other challenges and threats. And I believe that many of the arguments people made then, it was going to destroy our alliances. I think our alliances, when we handed off to the Trump administration, were at all-time highs. We wouldn't be able to get Afghan allies out of Afghanistan. After we left in August, we got tens of thousands of Afghan allies out right to the last day of the Biden administration. And it's actually not the Taliban, it's the Trump administration that is stopping interpreters and others who want to get out of Afghanistan to come to the United States. Or, for that matter, that it would make Afghanistan the center of global terrorism once again. We were able actually to take out the al-Qaeda emir, bin Laden's deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, from over the horizon without troops on the ground. And the main terrorist threats that we face now actually emanate from other places. Afghanistan remains a place we have to watch carefully, but it is not the epicenter of global terrorism. So I believe that history will judge President Biden's decision on Afghanistan well, even though we had to contend with grave difficulties in that period and the loss of brave American servicemen.
So there's the exit, which, as you said, was messy. Maybe that was unavoidable. But then there are the consequences for the Ukrainians and Ukrainian women in particular.
The Afghans.
I'm sorry, the Afghani women have really seen a radical retrenchment from a situation where the U.S. was involved and there was an opportunity for education, for advancement, to a situation where it's been really a very reactionary response by the Taliban.
There is no sugarcoating this. It is a deplorable situation, just horrendous, that women in Afghanistan are subjugated. They are not given their rights. They are not given their basic dignity. And that is a fact of Taliban rule. But, President Biden looked at this situation and said, basically, I will do what I can around the world to support the cause of women's rights, but I can't sustain an indefinite war on that. I cannot keep sending soldiers to fight and die as the tool for that. We have to find whatever other tools are available to us, but not that one. So it is, I very much acknowledge, without any caveat or qualification, that has been a terrible consequence. But when you're president, you have to decide, can you tell the American people we are going to stay in a long-term war for this purpose, and President Biden decided he could not do that.
You've described China as America's pacing challenge, meaning that there is a rare capacity the Chinese have, economic and political, and obviously military, that could pose very significant and horrendous costs to the United States. There are a number of people in Congress, both parties, who express fear about China, who see the threat of China as existential, and feel that across several administrations, not just the Biden administration, we've dropped the ball. There's been a kind of general indifference to the Chinese threat. Do you see the threat by China as existential? That should be the kind of consuming focus of U.S. foreign policy?
I think two things are true at once, and we need to acknowledge both of them. The first is that China has the ambition and frankly has a lot of capacity to potentially, if we don't do our part, replace the United States as the world's leading economic, technological, military, and diplomatic power. And second, whatever happens in the competition with the US and China, neither the US or China are going anywhere anytime soon. So we have to learn to live alongside one another as major powers. And that means that we need to compete vigorously for leadership in technology, for economic robustness. We need to push back against unfair economic practices. We need to compete, but we need to manage that competition so that it doesn't tip over into conflict. And we need to find ways to work together where it's in our mutual interest to do so. The US and China have to work together on climate. The US and China have to work together, even as we're racing on AI against one another. We need to be talking to one another about the possibility of AI misalignment that could harm both the US and China, as well as the rest of the world. That is a principled, strong strategy with respect to China, and it's not a new Cold War, and it's not permanent confrontation. It's robust competition, but managed so that we avoid conflict and we still find areas of cooperation. It doesn't fit neatly on a bumper sticker, but it's the right strategy. It's a strategy that we pursued vigorously over our 4 years. And I believe that that actually also reflects the common sense of the American people who, want us to compete and want us to push back where our interests are affected, but also don't want to go to war with China. If it can be avoided. So I think this is both the right strategy at the level of theory, and it's the right strategy with respect to the informed consent of the American people.
There's plenty of folks who feel that the U.S. is playing the role of the world policeman. And, should we be sending weapons to Ukraine, to Israel? Is this like our mission in life? But there's also concern about Taiwan. Why is the U.S. Putting the stake of our country, particularly some of Joe Biden's comments about the response of the U.S. Suggesting kind of certainty as to what we would do if China did invade Taiwan. Why would we put so much on that? Why? Here you're talking to a bunch of folks. Is it worth it?
Well, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have cataclysmic consequences for the global economy. And to put that quite simply, that would hit every single American hard. A massive amount of the world's trade flows through the Taiwan Strait. That would be disrupted in ways that would ripple through our economy. More than 90%, nearly 100% of those advanced chips that power everything in our lives are produced on this little island off the coast of China called Taiwan. If you have that shut down, we're talking depression level economic consequences globally, including in the United States. So that war cannot and should not happen. And it's not inevitable. I believe that through deterrence and diplomacy, we can keep that war from taking place. And that should be the object of U.S. policy. And that has been the bipartisan object of U.S. policy going back decades now. And we have been able at an elemental level to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And over the 4 years of the Biden administration, we were able to do that. Now, you've recently heard the Secretary of Defense say publicly he's concerned that war over Taiwan is imminent. I'm not sure what exactly motivated that comment, but the object of U.S. policy should not be go fight a war over Taiwan. It should be deter a war over Taiwan, make sure that war doesn't happen. And that requires us supporting Taiwan, not leaving them naked and exposed. But it also requires us to sit down for detailed and intensive discussions with the PRC, with Beijing. And I personally did that, and President Biden did that at length with Xi Jinping. And that is the right formula, I think, for managing this, so that one of the worst case scenarios in global affairs, a war over Taiwan, doesn't come to pass.
After Donald Trump won election in 2017, you started to give presentations and writing about the importance of anchoring U.S. foreign policy in the middle class. And you wrote at one point, the American people need to be able to trust that the U.S. foreign policy professionals are managing the tremendous responsibility as best they can with the interests of the American middle class at the forefront. What happened? Donald Trump, ran a campaign in which he attacked our foreign policy and Joe Biden's foreign policy as not serving the interests of the country, and there seemed to be some support for that.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. So first, I have said that the phrase foreign policy for the middle class really broke through, which I think is good because I think it's a right argument. We should make it. But I slightly regret having been part of that formulation because it sounds like it's meant as a political argument. It's not meant as a political argument. The observation I was making was about what is the right policy and what should we be doing when we sit in the Situation Room or the Oval Office and decide on our foreign policy priorities. I found that over the course of the kind of post-Cold War era, U.S. foreign policy existed more in abstract theory than in the rooted lives of working people in the United States. And the argument I was making was, let's get to that. And I believe in the Biden administration, we took really substantial steps in that direction. Now, the question of whether we were able to show that on a political level is another one, and was sort of beyond my remit as national security advisor. But there's also a question about the extent to which these foreign policy arguments President Trump was making were really at the center of the election, if that's really what it was that he was selling. Like, just as an example, I believe, and I know this is a matter of some contestation, that actually there is still to this day, strong bipartisan support for helping Ukraine. And that if you look at opinion polling, are we doing too much, too little, or the right amount? Too little and the right amount far outpace too much in terms of where the American people are. So I don't think on some of these arguments where he said, oh, you're spending money over there, not back here, that those were really resonating with a strong majority of the American people. That's me being an amateur pundit because I'm not actually sure what the answer is. But there's a reason that you saw the outpouring of Ukrainian flags spontaneously across this country. It's because the American people instinctively know two things. One, if it's a fight between a bully and a little guy, you want to be on the side of the little guy against the bully. And two, if you leave aggression unchecked in Europe, it usually comes back at a greater cost to America later. And we've learned that lesson the hard way in the past. So I think that in a lot of these areas where the conventional wisdom in Washington is, oh, the American people are tired of any of this stuff, I don't actually entirely buy that. I think the American people have a view of enlightened self-interest, which goes back to Tocqueville. This, as he says, core in the American character, that we believe in pursuing our own self-interest, yes, but we also think we're better off when others are better off. And that's an instinct that's like quite uniquely distinctive about this country and still applies today, even in the face of a president who is making deeply zero-sum arguments. I think there's still, and there's an audience for that, I think there is a majority that believes in positive sum.
We've got a couple questions here about a recent book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson called Original Sin. And this book argues that Joe Biden's cognitive decline was covered up. And I want to just ask you kind of pointedly, did you have any concerns when you were meeting with President Biden that he wasn't up to the task?
Look, I have been asked this question a few times, and I give the same answer because it's the truth, which is I sat in the Oval Office in the Situation Room with President Biden for 4 years, and I saw him in crisis situations, and I saw him dealing with complex policy issues like semiconductor export controls, and I saw him discharging his duties as Commander in Chief. I was telling the students from Southwest earlier today about an episode in the Situation Room in October of 2024, just a few weeks before the presidential election, maybe even only a couple weeks before the presidential election. Here, President Biden had already dropped out of the race, and Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. And you had the president at the chair of the Situation Room table, and you had the commander of Central Command on the screen, basically narrating what was going on. And you had the president making important, timely decisions, and then engaging with his Israeli counterpart on this issue. And that's just one of a dozen examples I could give you just from the last few months of what I saw from President Biden in office.
Having seen, as you have, a number of administrations change party control, it's not unusual to see shifts in foreign policy and national security. And I think there are a lot of concerns here, and certainly in the questions, about the nature of Donald Trump's shifts in our foreign policy, the relationship with our allies, global trade, and national security more broadly. And I'm curious how you would evaluate it. Is this, in your view, represent a kind of fundamental breaching, a kind of revolution in American foreign policy that cannot be restored by a future administration? Or is this like a more aggressive form of what we often see, which is a shift in emphasis, change in policy that is kind of endures some kind of correction in the future? Is it structural damage, or is this something that you think is part of the ebb and flow of U.S. foreign policy and national security?
I would give two answers to that question. The first is when it comes to the core foundation of our transatlantic alliance, I think there's no going back to exactly how things were before. I think that the impact of the Vance speech in Munich, the Zelensky moment in the Oval, the trade war has left Europe basically saying we are going to need a different relationship with the U.S. going forward. I don't believe that means it will have to be a bad relationship. It could be a very good one, but it will be different. In that sense, what's happened has had a structural impact. Other aspects of his foreign policy, could be adjusted in a different way by a different president. But the second answer to your question is I think this goes way deeper than foreign policy. And it goes back to what I was saying before about America's advantages. What is all of America's kind of approach to leadership in the world built on? I think it's really built on a few foundational pillars. Lee Kuan Yew said that China can draw on the talent of 1 billion people. The United States can draw on the talent of 7 billion people because we can attract talent from all over the world. We lose that or we erode that. That's structural. I talked about the innovation ecosystem of the US and how that's being dismantled. The confidence of the world in America's capital markets and our dollar is core to our ability to do everything in the world, and that is being put at risk in a fundamental way. I talked about America's alliance system, the envy of the world. I was speaking with a friend of mine who had recently been in Beijing talking to Chinese officials, from the think tank world, my friends from the think tank world. And one of the Chinese officials offhandedly kind of said, hey, you guys are doing all the work that we had set out hoping to do to undermine America's alliance system. You're just doing it for us. Okay. And then the final thing, and the most important thing, the pillar underpinning all the other pillars, is the rule of law in our Constitution. Because that, you go with that, and it just puts everything else about this country, this democracy, this society at risk. So to me, the thing that keeps me up at night more than a question, and I am deeply troubled by moves on Ukraine and other things. But that keeps me up at night are these deeply core and fundamental aspects of the United States of America and our constitutional democracy that are being put at risk. And that is something that I think collectively across the board needs to be pushed back against very vigorously.
So you're working on a book now, and let's imagine the scenario in which you're very quick in writing your book and it gets published. So in other words, it's out in 2 to 3 years.
Thank you for giving me the grace of a long time.
I speak as an author, so you get my sympathy. And the book takes on the theme of what did we learn from the election of Donald Trump twice, and the nature of this administration, and the points you've just made. What would be the new version of American foreign policy that you would be talking about that would build on, this experience you've had from 2017 through, recently?
Well, Larry, I think everyone here is going to have to buy the book. And then they will see. And by then I will have an answer to that question. In all seriousness, I am grappling with this. It feels like a lifetime in some respects, but today's June 5th. It's been 4.5 months since Donald Trump was inaugurated. 4.5 months. I slept for about one of those months, So I have a lot of processing to do to not just distill the lessons learned, but then say, what does that tell us about the way we go forward? One of the questions I'm asking is, was 2024, did it say something truly deeply, just the outcome of the election, structural about where the American people are, or was it a more contingent kind of election in a post-COVID world where anti-incumbent sentiment the world over was very intense? Where inflation was a major issue and so forth. And I don't know the answer to that question yet, but that's one of the things that I will grapple with is how to read the results without underreading them or overreading them. And I think being somewhat disciplined about that is an important part of the exercise.
I mean, I would just throw into the stew pot a couple observations. One is that President Biden's commitment to pulling out of Afghanistan represented a significant disinterest among many Americans with being the world's policeman, with a sense of the ongoing ever war. The other would be, we went through a bipartisan period of kind of belief in markets. It was called the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism. And, in some ways, this was a dramatic and important shift, but in other ways, it left us dependent on other countries. And so the precarious position of the US economy in being so reliant on Chinese rare earths is a product of this. We're going to rely on markets. We're going to defer to whatever trade relationships make the most sense. And yes, there's an efficiency in having China take over and monopolize rare earths. Meanwhile, what is the significance for our national and economic security?
It's interesting with the current or actually, he's just left recently. The Prime Minister Lee of Singapore, the son of Lee Kuan Yew, was talking about supply chains. He says, we shifted to a world of just-in-time supply chains, which essentially meant that we had these dangerous dependencies. And instead of just-in-time, what we need is just-in-case. We got to have supply chains that are sufficiently diverse and resilient that if there's a crisis, whether it's COVID or Chinese coercion or something else, we are not reliant on single sources that are outside of our control. And it's so interesting because, if you worked in national security 10 years ago, someone uttered the word supply chain, you kind of look at them like, what are you talking about? Now it is a core part of the strategy of how we get to genuine resilience, national security resilience going forward. So I think that observation is an incredibly profound and powerful one, and spans, it's not just about Trump. That is about a shift that I think has very much captured the attention of both parties.
There was a recent article by the kind of seminal thinkers in national security, Bob Cohen and Joe Nye, in foreign affairs, which is kind of the in place to publish if you want to have an impact on U.S. foreign policy. And Jake Sullivan, you've had what, 3 articles in there?
Sounds right.
Yeah. So, and in it, they argued that President Trump is inordinately committed to coercion and the exercise of America's hard power, such as the reliance on using trade dependencies of other countries. And he doesn't seem to understand soft power and its role in foreign policy. What do those terms, hard power and soft power, mean to you? And do you agree with that diagnosis?
Well, first, I should say Joe Nye, who coined the term soft power, passed away very recently. He was a colleague at the Kennedy School. And I once, when I was younger, sat on a plane next to him randomly. And it was like, sitting next to a movie star for me, like a nerd like me, next to Joe Nye, the then dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. And I remember asking him for advice, and he said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, everyone, you have to act like life is short because it could be over tomorrow, but you also have to act like life is long and that you're going to be around for a while, and don't think you have to rush and do everything immediately, because 20, 30 years from now, you look back and say, why in my 20s didn't I take more time basically to go be a ski bum or do whatever? I, of course, did not take my time to go be a ski bum, but now, as I approach 50, I'm like, Joe Nye was so right. Why didn't I take more time? Life is short, but life could be long. So that wasn't your question, but it was an aside. His concept of soft power. So hard power is economic sanctions and military force. It is the power to compel. Soft power is diplomacy and foreign assistance and moral authority. It is the power to persuade. And a sustainable foreign policy requires a blend and mix of those two elements, lest we lose kind of our identity or our purpose. And I think that their basic diagnosis of the current president's essential rejection of soft power as somehow weakness is correct. And I think it comes at a cost to the United States.
We've got a question here from a former math teacher of yours at Southwest.
Oh, no.
It's okay. I think you'll do fine with it. How can we support public education that brings critical thinking to students?
That is a great question. I was talking to the Southwest students earlier, and one of them asked me the question, who's the thinker or mentor who had the biggest impact on how you think? And I was telling the story of Justice Breyer, who I clerked for, teaching me how to keep an open mind. And he was an extremely open-minded person. And I do worry that for a variety of reasons, open-mindedness as a habit is getting squeezed, and that has a huge impact on critical thinking. Because if you're not open to argument, open to evidence, open to rigorous debate, then the likelihood that you will think critically as opposed to think reflexively goes way down. And I think that the only way really to do this is make sure that we're doing two things. One, putting the resources into our public education system that they deserve so that administrators and teachers have the tools to be able to impart this kind of learning to students. And then the second thing is that we need to model leadership in this country at every level, in the public sector, in the private sector, in the philanthropic sector, so that there's a larger ecosystem wrapped around public education where people are seeing role models actually stepping up to a different kind of discourse. Larry, we were talking last night about how civics has kind of faded away from public education. I think restoring that could be an important part of this effort. And then the final thing I would say is, because of geographic political segregation, people tend to live around people who agree with them. We need to find a way to mix up young people. I don't mean like some sort of extreme busing or airplane scheme. I mean more like, is there something about a universal form of service where students from all over the country are put together from different backgrounds and get to know one another. Because I worry part of what's also depleting our reservoir of critical thinking and open-mindedness is people are mostly around people they agree with and not people they disagree with. And then they other the people they disagree with. So there's got to be a fix to that. I don't have quite the answer, but it's something I have certainly seen growing at some risk to this country.
Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jake Sullivan. This is the mic drop second. I just want to make a couple closing reminders. This is a 35th anniversary of the Policy Fellows program. This is a leadership development program. Jake Sullivan has spoken to the Policy Fellows. It was started by Walter Mondale and Jerry Joseph 35 years ago. Vin Weber and Tim Penny directed it for a dozen years, and I've been directing it for 20. July 16th, it's your opportunity to come and celebrate with us and also to support scholarships. Want to remind you, if you're interested in this conversation, it will be up online as a podcast in 1 to 2 days. And finally, I want to give a warm thanks again to our sponsor, Kiyoshi Nagasaka.
Yeah, thank you, Kiyoshi.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today.